Long-term research on ultra-processed diets paints a bleak, deeply troubling picture. Early and sustained exposure to these foods is strongly linked to adult obesity, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease, often with consequences that accumulate silently for decades before finally erupting into full-blown illness. Longitudinal studies across multiple countries consistently show that individuals who consume significant amounts of ultra-processed foods in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood face dramatically higher risks of chronic disease later in life, risks that cannot be fully undone even when diet improves later on. The biological imprint left by years of processed food exposure is far more persistent and damaging than many people realize. One of the most striking findings in long-term studies is how strongly early exposure predicts adult obesity. Children and teenagers who regularly eat sugary cereals, fast food, packaged snacks, convenience meals, and sweetened beverages often develop altered hunger patterns, impaired metabolic regulation, and higher baseline insulin levels before they ever enter adulthood. These early disruptions prime the body to store fat more easily and burn it less efficiently. Because adolescence is such a critical period for metabolic development, ultra-processed diets hardwire the body to maintain a higher weight set point for life. Longitudinal cohorts show that even when individuals adopt healthier habits later on, their bodies remain more resistant to weight loss and more prone to weight regain. In simple terms, the damage done early stays with them. Metabolic syndrome, an extremely dangerous cluster of conditions including high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, abnormal cholesterol, and abdominal fat, is also strongly tied to long-term consumption of ultra-processed foods. Studies following individuals for 10, 20, and even 30 years reveal that frequent consumption of processed foods steadily increases insulin resistance, disrupts lipid metabolism, and elevates inflammation. These changes happen gradually and often without obvious symptoms, making them easy to ignore until they become irreversible. Many adults in their 30s and 40s discover they have prediabetes, fatty liver disease, or hypertension without understanding that their risk began accumulating during childhood and adolescence when they first developed a dependence on high sugar, high fat, nutrient-poor foods. Cardiovascular disease risk rises even more sharply with long-term processed food consumption. Ultra-processed diets promote atherosclerosis, the buildup of arterial plaque, through multiple mechanisms: chronic inflammation, insulin spikes, oxidative stress, and harmful shifts in gut microbiota. Research tracking tens of thousands of adults shows that even a modest increase in ultra-processed food consumption is associated with significantly higher rates of heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular mortality. The effect is dose-dependent and cumulative. People who consume these foods daily for decades often experience accelerated arterial aging, meaning their cardiovascular systems deteriorate earlier than expected. Some studies show that consistent ultra-processed food intake in youth can shave years off heart health by midlife. Another disturbing finding from long-term research is that processed foods leave metabolic scars. These are lasting biological changes, from impaired insulin signaling to chronic inflammation, that persist even when a person switches to whole foods. Children exposed to processed diets show long-term alterations in gut microbiota that affect immune regulation and metabolic stability years later. Teens who consume high levels of artificial additives, emulsifiers, and refined sugars develop hormonal patterns that make appetite regulation more difficult well into adulthood. Over time, these disruptions accumulate, making it harder for individuals to maintain a healthy weight or prevent metabolic decline. The psychological consequences also accumulate across the lifespan. People exposed to processed foods early often develop long-lasting reward pathway adaptations in the brain, making them more prone to cravings, stress eating, and addictive-like behaviors as adults. These patterns increase the likelihood of overeating during times of emotional strain, which further accelerates metabolic deterioration. This is one reason why adult obesity is so difficult to reverse. By the time individuals recognize the problem, their biology has been altered for years. The greatest danger of all is how invisible the progression is. Ultra-processed diets rarely cause immediate pain or dramatic short-term symptoms. Instead, the damage accumulates quietly. Blood sugar slowly rises, inflammation increases a little more each year, arterial plaque builds millimeter by millimeter. By the time symptoms appear, fatigue, weight gain, hypertension, chest discomfort, the underlying biological damage has often been developing for decades. Many adults mistakenly believe their health problems came out of nowhere, when in reality the foundation was laid long ago through years of dietary exposure that seemed harmless at the time. The warning from longitudinal research is unambiguous. Ultra-processed foods are not merely unhealthy choices. They are slow-building drivers of chronic disease that begin harming the body long before outward symptoms appear. Early exposure reshapes metabolism, appetite regulation, cardiovascular function, and inflammatory pathways in ways that persist into adulthood and old age. People who grow up in food environments dominated by processed foods face a lifetime of elevated risk that cannot be easily reversed. Unless individuals and society as a whole recognize the lifelong consequences of these diets, future generations will continue to face rising rates of obesity, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease at younger and younger ages. The damage is cumulative, long-lasting, and far more severe than most people understand, making ultra-processed diets one of the most urgent public health threats of our time.